All right, let's jump right into it today. We've got scorching heat waves, electric vehicle revolutions, and a whole lot of political drama on the menu today.
Sounds like a packed agenda.
Definitely is. So we're kicking things off with a weather warning. Rio de Janeiro is currently facing a brutal heat wave.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, temperatures are soaring. We're talking a record 107 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow, I can't even imagine trying to hit the beach in that kind of heat.
Yeah, pretty intense. But speaking of intense, let's shift gears a bit. We found this interesting development. Zambia is aiming to leverage the electric vehicle boom to fight both poverty and gang violence.
That's quite the connection.
Right. So tell me more about it. What's the story there?
Well, Zambia actually has these vast copper reserves.
Uh-huh.
And copper, as you know, is crucial for EV batteries.
Right.
But here's the thing. A lot of the mining that's happening right now is actually unregulated, often dangerous.
Oh, I see.
And the communities who are depending on this kind of informal mining, they're not really seeing the benefits.
Yeah, makes sense.
So the government's strategy is to try and attract international investment to develop the industry, but in a more sustainable and equitable way.
That sounds like a really good plan, in theory at least. But I can only imagine there are some pretty big hurdles to overcome. What are some of the major challenges they're facing?
Yeah, for sure. There are definitely challenges. Basically, they're trying to balance, right? You've got the economic benefits of mining on one hand,
Right.
but then you also have to protect the environment and, of course, ensure that local communities aren't left behind in the process.
It's a tough balancing act. It makes you wonder, are other resource-rich countries facing similar dilemmas?
Absolutely. South Africa, for instance, is pushing for local processing of what they call transition minerals. Instead of just exporting raw materials, they want to move up the value chain.
That's a smart move. If they can pull it off, it could have a significant impact on their economy, right? And it could also really shake things up in the global supply chain for these crucial minerals.
Exactly. But of course, they've got their own set of challenges to deal with. Competition from China, which, as you know, pretty much dominates the processing sector, is a big one.
It seems like everything that happens on the world stage has a ripple effect, right? Like what happens in one place can have a big impact on events far away.
You're absolutely right. And speaking of impactful actions, we need to turn our attention to the U.S. Trump's return to power has triggered some pretty big changes, especially when it comes to climate change policy.
Right. From what I've seen, his administration has frozen spending on a whole bunch of climate and clean energy projects. It's basically brought progress on some key initiatives to a standstill.
Right. It's definitely created a lot of uncertainty in the sector. Companies and local governments, they're all wondering what the future holds for these projects. And the funding freeze isn't just limited to climate-specific initiatives either.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it also affects things like flood protection for public buildings and even wildfire prevention efforts.
Could you dive a little deeper into the potential consequences of these actions? What kind of tangible effects might we actually see?
Well, for starters, companies that were counting on federal support for their clean energy investments, they're now facing financial instability. Some have even had to resort to layoffs because of the uncertainty.
Wow, that's rough.
And imagine this. Public buildings in flood-prone areas being rebuilt without adequate protection.
With the kind of extreme weather events we're seeing more and more these days, that's a pretty worrying prospect.
Exactly. Proactive mitigation is essential. And then there's the impact on wildfire prevention efforts. The freeze has hampered those efforts, which leaves communities in high-risk zones much more vulnerable.
And I'm guessing every decision like this sparks its own share of controversy and legal challenges.
Oh, you bet. States and organizations are questioning the legality of these funding freezes left and right. And we're also seeing this interesting dynamic. Some Republican lawmakers who were initially totally against climate spending, they're now trying to get funds from those same programs for projects in their own districts.
It's amazing how national rhetoric can often crash with what's actually happening on the ground.
Absolutely. So the big question is, where does all of this leave the future of climate action, both in the U.S. and globally?
Yeah, what's the outlook?
Well, there are definitely concerns that these actions are going to hinder progress towards climate goals. Some experts are even predicting an increased reliance on fossil fuels, which would mean higher emissions and, of course, a worsening climate situation.
I can see how that would happen.
But on a slightly more positive note, there's also a growing movement for states, cities, and the private sector to step up and fill the void left by federal inaction.
So it's like taking 2 steps back and then 1 step forward.
It's a really complex and constantly changing situation with impacts across so many different sectors. And the impact is even reaching some pretty unexpected areas.
Like what? What do you mean by unexpected?
Well, it actually involves a rather fascinating creature, Gila monsters.
Gila monsters. Those venomous lizards, how on earth do they fit into all of this?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Gila monsters produce a specific compound that was actually crucial in developing a drug called Ozempic.
Okay.
It's a diabetes treatment.
Right.
But guess what? Trump's funding cuts are now impacting research on these very Gila monsters.
So wait, are you saying the fate of a species and potentially some groundbreaking medical breakthroughs are hanging in the balance because of this?
Potentially, yes. There's this chemist who actually left a big pharmaceutical company to focus on studying Gila monsters and their conservation.
Wow.
His work holds incredible promise both for science and medicine.
That's fascinating. It really highlights how seemingly disconnected events can be intertwined in the most unexpected ways.
It really does. It shows that the consequences of political decisions can be far-reaching and often totally unforeseen. It's not just at the national level. Either these political shifts are even happening within parties themselves. Take Germany's Green Party, for example. They're actually toning down their climate policies.
Germany. Really? I always thought of them as being at the forefront of climate action. Why the change in strategy?
Well, it looks like Germany's been wrestling with some economic challenges.
I see.
And the far right has been pretty successful at framing climate policies as the culprit. They're using terms like eco-dictatorship to tap into those anxieties about rising costs.
Eco-dictatorship. What do they mean by that?
Basically, they're pushing this idea that environmental regulations are way too restrictive
Uh-huh.
and that they infringe on personal freedoms.
So even in countries with strong climate commitments, things can get shaky when economic and political pressures mount.
Exactly. And speaking of vulnerability, we need to talk about the aftermath of Hurricane Helene.
Oh yeah, Helene. That was devastating. It ravaged parts of North Carolina and Tennessee, what was it, just a few months ago?
Right. And the recovery has been anything but smooth. A lot of survivors are still displaced,
Oh, wow.
living in temporary shelters, many without insurance or adequate government aid.
That's awful.
There's a lot of frustration brewing with federal agencies like FEMA, and there's this growing distrust not just in the government but also in science.
Distrust in science. Why is that?
Well, it seems to be tied to the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories about the hurricane. Some folks are actually pushing this idea that the hurricane was engineered by the government.
Oh, wow. So instead of seeing the hurricane as a consequence of climate change, they're attributing it to some kind of government plot.
Exactly. It just goes to show how disinformation can take root, especially in communities that are already struggling and feeling neglected.
Are there any glimmers of hope amidst all of these challenges?
Well, while the federal government's scaling back its efforts, we're seeing a surge in action at the state and local levels. California, for example, is forging ahead with rebuilding efforts after those destructive wildfires.
Okay.
And they're laser focused on safety, resilience, and affordability.
So it sounds like they're learning from past mistakes and really trying to build back better.
Yeah, it seems that way. They're implementing stricter building codes,
Makes sense.
investing in fire-resistant materials, and they're really encouraging those community-based solutions.
Oh, that's great.
And importantly, they're not forgetting about the need for affordable housing, especially for essential workers.
It's a complex challenge for sure. It requires a lot of careful thought and planning.
Definitely. And this trend isn't limited to California. We're seeing similar initiatives popping up all over the country. Cities and communities are taking the lead in tackling climate change and building a more sustainable future.
It seems like there's this growing realization that action can't always wait for the federal government.
Exactly. And it's not just about mitigating the negative impacts. It's also about seizing the opportunities that come with transitioning to a cleaner, more sustainable economy. Remember that drilling expert we talked about earlier, the one who's shifting from oil and gas to geothermal energy?
Yeah, that was a fascinating story.
Well, he's not alone. More and more workers and companies are recognizing the potential of clean energy and making the switch.
It's about creating new pathways for workers and communities to thrive in this changing economy.
You got it. And this shift is happening globally. We've already talked about Zambia and South Africa.
Right?
But countless other countries are also exploring how to leverage their resources for a more sustainable future.
It's encouraging to see such innovation and creativity in the face of these challenges.
It really is. It's a time of both uncertainty and opportunity. And the choices we make today will have a lasting impact. Speaking of choices, we need to address the growing tension between the U.S. and Germany when it comes to renewable energy.
Oh, what's going on there?
Well, the new U.S. Energy Secretary, who used to be a packing executive, by the way, has been quite critical of Germany's transition to renewables. He's calling it expensive and unreliable.
Wow. Germany's been seen as a pioneer in renewable energy, right? What's the basis for his criticism?
His argument is that Germany's reliance on renewables has made them too dependent on foreign manufacturing,
Okay.
that it's led to higher energy costs for consumers. He's basically using Germany as a cautionary tale. He's advocating for sticking with fossil fuels, particularly natural gas.
That's a pretty stark contrast to what we're hearing from other parts of the world.
It is.
How are people responding to his claims?
Well, a lot of energy experts are pushing back. They're pointing out that Germany's energy costs are partly a result of geopolitical factors like the war in Ukraine.
That's a good point.
And they're highlighting all the progress Germany has made in increasing renewable energy use and reducing emissions.
It seems like we're witnessing a clash of ideologies here. The U.S. clinging to fossil fuels while other countries are embracing renewable energy.
It does seem that way. And it raises the question of whether the U.S. risks falling behind in this global clean energy race.
The energy landscape is definitely changing, and the decisions we make now will have huge implications down the road.
Absolutely. And speaking of consequences, remember those record-breaking temperatures in Rio we talked about?
Yeah,
Well, scientists are now suggesting that a decline in cloud cover might be contributing to the recent surge in global temperatures.
wait, clouds. How do clouds factor into global warming?
It's all about the Earth's reflectivity. Clouds act like a giant sunshade.
I see.
They reflect sunlight back into space. So a decrease in cloud cover means more solar energy gets absorbed by the Earth's surface, which leads to higher temperatures.
So could this create a kind of feedback loop, like less cloud cover leads to higher temperatures, which then leads to even less cloud cover?
That's exactly the concern. It's a complex and evolving area of research, but it underscores the interconnectedness of our climate system and the potential for these cascading effects.
You mentioned record rainfall in California earlier. Did all that rain at least help to replenish the state's depleted groundwater supplies?
Not as much as you might think. There's a new study that used seismic data to monitor groundwater levels, and it found that even after a whole year of extreme storms, atmospheric rivers, Hurricane Hillary, all of that,
Yeah,
deep aquifers in Los Angeles are still severely depleted.
that's kind of surprising. I would have thought all that rain would have made a bigger difference.
Well, groundwater recharge is a slow process, and years of overpumping have really taken their toll. Some aquifers might even have collapsed irreversibly.
So even with these extreme weather events, we can't afford to be complacent about our water resources.
Absolutely. Groundwater depletion is a global problem that's only going to get worse as climate change messes with rainfall patterns and increases water demand.
It's a complex and daunting challenge. What's the main takeaway from all of these stories? What's the connecting thread?
We live in a world of interconnected systems. What happens in one part of the world, whether it's political decisions, scientific discoveries, or extreme weather, it has ripple effects that reach far and wide.
It's like this giant tapestry with each thread woven into the others.
Exactly. And it's crucial to understand these connections because the choices we make today, they will shape the world of tomorrow. Now let's switch gears for a moment and head over to the Egyptian desert. Paleontologists have unearthed an almost complete skull of a previously unknown carnivore.
Oh, wow.
This creature roamed the earth something like 30 million years ago.
30 million years. Can you paint a picture of this creature for us? What did it look like?
Imagine a predator about the size of a leopard, but with these powerful jaws and teeth that were perfectly designed for crushing bones. It belonged to an extinct group called Hyonodonta,
Hynodonta.
which were like the top predators of their time.
So kind of like a prehistoric supersized hyena.
Yeah, you could say that. This discovery reminds us that Earth has been home to such an incredible array of creatures throughout its history, and we're really just beginning to scratch the surface of understanding them. Which brings us to a new study about how we can use knowledge of the past to inform our actions in the present, specifically when it comes to climate change.
Okay, how so?
Researchers are suggesting that reintroducing wolves to the Scottish Highlands could actually help mitigate climate change.
Wolves as climate warriors.
It's all about the cascading effects of ecosystem restoration. Wolves, being apex predators, influence the behavior of their prey.
Right.
In this case, deer. So by controlling deer populations, wolves would allow native woodlands to regenerate.
And those woodlands would then act as carbon sinks, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Got it. The study estimates that reintroducing wolves could lead to woodland expansion that could capture and store up to 1 million tons of CO2 every year.
That's incredible. It really highlights the potential of nature-based solutions for tackling climate change.
It does. It emphasizes a more holistic approach to addressing climate change, one that recognizes the interconnectedness of ecosystems and the vital role of biodiversity in maintaining a healthy planet.
It really makes you think how everything's connected, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Speaking of connections, you mentioned that we'd be covering the race for electric vehicle dominance today. How does that fit into all of this?
Well, it goes back to those materials needed for EV batteries. The demand is through the roof right now, leading to a global scramble for resources like copper and lithium. We already talked about Zambia and South Africa trying to get a piece of the action.
Right, right. What are some other key developments in this EV race?
We're seeing a big push for regional partnerships to secure those supply chains. The European Union, for instance, is cozying up to countries like Chile and Australia.
I see.
They've got tons of those critical minerals. The goal is to lessen their dependence on China, which pretty much has a stranglehold on the market right now.
So it sounds like geopolitics are playing a major role in the shift to electric vehicles.
Absolutely. It's not just about economic competition anymore. It's about strategic alliances and national security. Control over these resources could really tip the scales in terms of global power in the coming decades.
What does all this mean for us regular folks? Should we expect to see the price of electric vehicles go up as this competition heats up?
It's definitely a possibility. The cost of raw materials is a big chunk of the overall price of EVs, so if demand keeps outstripping supply, we could see those prices climb. But on the other hand, technological advancements and economies of scale could help keep prices in check. It's a bit of a seesaw situation, really.
So it sounds like this is much bigger than just a race for market share. It's about reshaping global industries and supply chains.
Exactly. The shift to electric vehicles is driving a fundamental change in the automotive industry and beyond. It's affecting mining, manufacturing, energy production, you name it.
It seems like every day brings new twists and turns in this fast-paced world. Who knows what other surprises await us as this transition unfolds. But for now, I think we've covered a lot of ground, from scorching heat waves to ancient predators and the future of transportation.
It just goes to show you have to stay informed to navigate this ever-changing world. It's about connecting the dots, understanding the forces at play, and being ready for those ripple effects.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the news. Hopefully we've given you some food for thought and maybe sparked some curiosity for you to explore further on your own.
Keep that curiosity alive. Staying engaged and informed is the key to understanding our world and shaping the future we want. 2050A?